Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. We're not going to do an intro today, or I guess this is the intro. This is the final episode. We're not ending the podcast, and 1,000,000% we're not ending the work of Palestine Solidarity, but we have a new season planned, and it's just time. I thought a lot about how to do this last episode. I decided to not do like a big guest. I don't know, maybe if I could have had like Emma Goldman or Walter Benjamin come on and talk to us about anti-Zionism. And I thought about what to do, and I decided it should just be me. So the final guest is me, and I'm joined by my friend Dr. Raz Segal, a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. And Raz was our first guest, and now we're going to switch places. So Raz, you're going to play host, and I guess I'll answer some questions. I think I'm going to try to weave in references to other episodes and not just make this my story, but something maybe more expansive. And answer the question of what is the responsibility and what are the possibilities of principled anti-Zionist Jewish education. I think I'm ultimately doing this because it's a little bit of a gimmick, but I think it serves some kind of purpose. I should say that I have a really, really hard time sharing anything about myself. Not like I'm afraid to speak, but rather I tell this story all the time that like my therapist once paused and looked at me and was like, but who is Jordan? And I don't know. I'm going to try to put myself out there because I've asked 40 people-ish, more or less, to have these deep, quiet, vulnerable conversations. And if these episodes can push someone to action, can do some small part of crumbling the bricks of settler colonialism and interrupting the Zionist structure, I think it's something. And I think I'm going to be the final guest because I think that my story is pretty unremarkable. And I don't say that to be self-deprecating, though I probably will be very self-deprecating throughout. But I just want to suggest that anyone can be an anti-Zionist. And in fact, everyone should be joining the Palestinian liberation movement. We say this constantly, and it's often hard to really feel it in these times. But not only will Palestine be free, but it will free us all. So, Raz, you want to take over?
Thank you, Jordan. It's good again to be with you here on your podcast, and I think it's an impressive project and an important project today, as you said towards the end, especially if we're thinking about Palestinian liberation and its broader significance. So we can maybe talk a bit more about what that means. What is the broader significance of Palestinian liberation? How does it relate to personal stories like the one that you will now walk us through your own journey? So I'm very curious to hear maybe just a brief thought, something heavy to throw right at the beginning that you might come back to. You don't have to respond to this, but I am interested in how did you become an anti-Zionist? But I'm also interested in really delving deep into this issue of what is an anti-Zionist. It's a kind of identity description that in a way is still within the Zionist trap, if we want to use that word, because we have to engage with Zionism, right? We're anti-Zionists. And I think there's a lot of things there's various kinds of elements to what I call here as a shorthand, the Zionist trap, which is also, there's a lot of things that it shares with kind of nationalist thinking and frames of feeling more broadly. So not to suggest that this is something somehow unique or absolutely exceptional. What does it in detail and in practice actually mean to be an anti-Zionist? But let's start with your journey and maybe, take us to your early Zionist.
I love that framing of the trap of Zionism. But let's come back to this. So, at the beginning, my mom is a convert. I grew up fully Jewish, but I always had a chip on my shoulder about that. Like, I think I internalized this idea of quote unquote real Jew, that I had to prove myself that I never really could because my bris, my bar mitzvah, my family, my deep love of brisket until I became a vegan, none of that mattered because of blood quanta. On her episode, the writer and organizer Anna Raja Gopal spoke about this stigma around conversion, and I always really, really felt that throughout my childhood. But I also deeply identified as Jewish. I really clung to like even like the objects of Judaism. I'm thinking back to when I was 4 or 5, my dad gave me this very tiny Star of David necklace, and I cherished it like it was some award. I used to even sleep with it until it got wrapped around my neck, and then I got scared of it. And I was so proud of that, but there was also a lot of Jewish silence and fear all around me. This kind of like half joking lesson that I really internalized. We would always tease the Orthodox because they were visibly Jewish. Like, what? You have a target on your back? Like, this was a frightening thing to me because I grew up with this real sense, like I think so many people on this podcast have shared, of thinking that the world didn't want us around. And so to visibilize ourselves placed us at risk. A few guests have shared this. Comedian Jess Solomon talked about that she learned about the Holocaust before she learned about being Jewish. There's an episode with the Jewish boomers against the occupation, Rachel Martin and Suki Blanc shared, I think Rachel shared how she just had these vivid nightmares throughout her childhood that she remembers decades later about just some figure coming to get her. And it was rooted in the Holocaust. I also grew up the term I would use is implicitly Jewish. I grew up in Delaware County, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. For folks who are listening outside the area, when people talk about annoying Philadelphia sports fans who are loud and aggressive, that's us, that's Delco. And that's an area that's very Catholic, but there's a minority of Jews around. And my parents moved there. I was born in San Francisco and lived there for about a year. And when I was still a baby, we moved back to Philly. And I think my parents were just looking for anywhere to move. And yet somehow everyone around us was Jewish. All of our neighbors were Jewish. So many of the people in my life just happened to be Jewish. So for instance, when my dad and I would run errands, like the person who cut my hair was Jewish. And this played out in my own choices as well, that at 5 years old, I went to summer camp, a camp, by the way, called Camp Arrowhead. When I was thinking about this episode, I was reflecting on some of these things, and all the cabins had like indigenous names. And I think certainly we always in the settler colonial state live in a anti-indigenous world, but I don't know, the 1990s were wild. Anyway, at 5 years old, I met my childhood best friend, Abe Schwartz. He just so happened to be Jewish, right? This thing kept playing out in all aspects of my life. And my Judaism was like it was very cultural. I didn't grow up speaking Hebrew. I didn't really participate in traditions beyond the high holidays. I would sometimes do Shabbat at a friend's house. All of this coalesces around this very particular form of secular Judaism that was so recognizable to me, being a millennial in the northeast of the US. And that's one in which Israel was never named, or was rarely named, and yet played a critical role. My form of Judaism was much more of one where Seinfeld was a religion in our household. I have the strongest memory of just sitting at my Bubby and Sadie's little kitchenette in their townhome and eating a toasted sesame bagel, piling it with a mountain of cream cheese, piling even more whitefish on top of that, and a slice of tomato, a red onion on top of that. Even much later when I met my partner, much later, we were 16 years old when we met. But when I met Laren, who I eventually married, she just happened to be Jewish, right? And I think on the very first episode, you spoke about this very deep sense of belonging in your growing up. I think that's something that I felt through these simple cultural practices and relationships. We don't really get fall here in Philadelphia anymore, but on those rare October days, I have this real sense memory of there's this crispness in the air, like 1 or 2 days in October. And I just suddenly rush back to being in a sukkah with Abe at 11 years old. And it's just this connection and belonging. And of course, all of this was kind of accidental and completely not. But I think what it played into is my education in terms of what I gravitated towards, in terms of things like Seinfeld or eating whitefish and bagels, or in terms of things that were rendered common sense for me, kind of like the state of Israel.
You always spoke now towards the end about the place of feelings, which, as you said, for me, played a very central role, I would say. Actually, I knew nothing actually about the place where I grew up. I felt connected. So it was really heavily about feelings. You spoke very little just now about feelings, about this crisp in the air, these October days that indeed I think are gone forever. Now, you said implicitly Jewish, which is very interesting. Is there anything else that you want to add about the emotional aspects of growing up in, as you say, an environment that always happens to be Jewish? So obviously not really by chance, and then where there's this kind of Israeli common sense. But what was the emotional kind of setting around this?
Yeah, I've had a difficult relationship to Judaism throughout my life. In particular, I really don't like synagogue. There's a great Nathan Fielder line where he's like, I hadn't been to synagogue in years because it was too boring. And that's 100% kind of, I have political issues with synagogue. I have kind of practical issues. And yet,
It's called Civic and
no, Kol Tzedek can be very meaningful. And that's what I was going to say, is that it doesn't matter what my relationship has been. When I hear Lecha Dodi come on, there's something that is activated that is the deepest sense of movement and connection. And I don't know why.
Is that fear also, that because you did mention fear and its connection to the Holocaust, of course. And
Yeah.
again, it wasn't, I can only imagine that it wasn't really based on anything that you knew necessarily about the Holocaust, for example. So what is that thing that you shared?
It wasn't named, and I don't think I had a real understanding of the who even, but there was some force that didn't want us around. That, of course, that's not true, right? There's where are Jews safer than suburban Philadelphia?
Or in Seinfeld's New York.
Right, exactly. But there was this sensation of, I'm never quite right here. I always need to, and that's where maybe we can get into the Israel stuff, that I never quite fit, and I always need to be slightly ready to go. Of course, the they is the Nazis, and then of course the they being this broad vilifying notion of the Arabs. Palestinian life can be condensed to this vague identity of a people who are trying to kick the Jews out and make it unsafe for Jews in the world.
So ready to go constantly where?
Right. It's always Israel, right? It's
Even though that's like where the Arabs, the Palestinians, quote unquote, are posing a great danger.
This is the thing, right? Is Israel's the only place that's safe for Jews in the world, and yet we have to have this occupying force because it's never safe for us there, and this shifting narrative that is somehow capturing both is nonsensical and yet works very well to uphold a settler colonial state.
In as much as your podcast, Jordan, is in a way a response or an intervention, and it's also related to Palestinian liberation. So there's a issue here that on the one hand, can we, and this is where the kind of complication or perhaps the paradox comes in, can we think about Jewish identity today detached from the Israeli state, which is now fully genocidal?
I think the answer in one way is no, we cannot divorce it. And another way, I think it kind of doesn't matter. I say this on a Jewish podcast, and I say this as somebody who was an organizer with Jewish Voice for Peace and now Jews Against White Supremacy. But I think that I made this entire podcast about Jewish education, but I get a little frustrated. There was a piece yesterday or 2 days ago that I think brought up a lot of important questions, but also received some pretty valid critiques in Jewish Currents. That Ariel Angel wrote a piece about how we need to build new Jewish institutions that are free of Zionism. And of course, I don't think that when Palestine is free and Zionism crumbles, it will be the legacy of Judaism for a long time. And I think that the reason that I organized as a Jew is, one, because I think it can be strategic, and two, because I think that we have to keep Zionism as part of Judaism because it's something we're going to have to reckon with for a very, very long time.
This kind of a paradox or just a kind of web of complications, complexities. When did things start to shift in this world of yours that was made up of more and more Jews?
Yeah. So maybe before I even get into how things shifted, I could talk a little bit more about Israel, because I think that hadn't even, the shift was that Israel came into the picture a bit more for me. I grew up not having much of a connection to Israel, but again, with the implicit Judaism, it was always this hidden lesson running through things. I grew up with stories of my grandparents. This is all post 67. Stories of my grandparents spending summers on a kibbutz. My dad would tell me about the time that he went. And then again, like everything in my house, it didn't say be a Zionist, do Zionism, but the Judaica in our house, in our friend's house, in our family's house, it was these very romantic and legitimating depictions. Okay, I have a great example of this. There was this tiny sculpture in my grandparents' house. I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Parasite, but it's about the size of the rock from that movie. I'll just leave that without comment. If you've seen the movie, it has some significance. But this little sculpture is of an IOF soldier, 7, 8-year-old. Jordan's not going to say IOF, but at the time I would have said an Israeli soldier who had been fighting for quote unquote freedom. So this IOF soldier is like slumped over the Wailing Wall with his gun right next to him, and he's praying. And I don't know, for whatever reason, I was obsessed with this thing. I would just sit and look at this weighty object. And that's this place where there's this hidden curriculum. I don't know what that would be. I'm just kind of thinking this in the moment, but like the battle is done and now we can rest, right? And we fought for our freedom and now we have the wall.
This ever you, Jordan, to at this stage, like you said, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, Jordan, did you like develop like you say, oh, I really want to visit one day, or
Yeah.
oh my God, it would be so great to be such a soldier in the Israeli army, guys, something like that ever kind of occur?
I always thought that Israel would be part of my future in some way. I think in my I'm a very dramatic person, very dramatic thinker. So I think in some of my bigger moments, I thought, I'm going to make Aliyah and join the IDF and all of this. I think for me at the time, it was much less that I had any desire to do things around Israel. It was, as a few of our guests have spoken about, it's the fact that Israel was just a settled fact, right? It wasn't this settler colonial political entity. It was just another nation state. And nation states are kind of a wall of nature. They've always been here. They're normal. They're not problematic. The United States is fine. I'm thinking back to a couple of episodes here. So the writer, artist, activist, comic book writer, Saul Brager, they talked about the endless efforts happening within their family and within the Jewish activities they'd take on. They told us, it's like, you laugh and it's horrifying and all of that at once, of how they went to Jewish summer camp and they were acting out. I think they were like part of the Palma, like they were just acting out being Zionist militia members or something like that. We had artist Joshua Schwabel and sibling scholar Shoshana Schwabel, and they talked about, I think Shoshana was the one who talked about how Holocaust memory was operationalized through, like they did this trip through the concentration camps, and that's something I've always wanted to do. And then there was this big climactic event, which was, now we have this conclusion. I think the way Shoshana put it is like it was exit through the gift shop, and the gift shop was Israel. Right? Look, the awful stuff that happened in the concentration camps, and that directly links to this happy ending. And since Shoshana's Josh lives in Germany and Shoshana's a German studies scholar, they both talked about how Germany operationalizes this entire narrative. Like, look how we've atoned for the Holocaust. Literally, our reason of state is Israel. And therefore, it's fine if our jackboot fascist cops are stomping on the necks of Jews who oppose a genocide. Like, it's
Very
that,
like keep
right. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
right, not implicit at all, and that's
right. And as you and I have spoken about a lot over the last few years, also not Jews. I mean that in the sense of these are Jews whose Judaism has been denied. People who are, I love that piece that we've talked about a bunch in the Columbia Spectator, that Jews in the Columbia encampment were called un-Jews. I think for my own story that just Israel has always, like I said, seemed like it would be part of my life. I think after my bar mitzvah, I thought I might spend time in Israel.
Did you know
Yeah.
Israel? Did you meet Israelis?
Yeah. I knew a bunch of Israelis. Again, it was always implicit. My tutor at the JCC, my bar mitzvah tutor, Eve, was Israeli. So I was like, had Israelis in the periphery. But I think the original question, this is a long way around to say, the original question you asked is like how things started to change. And
Yeah. About this question. And I'm asking about connection with Israelis to get a sense of what you really, knew, but also what you felt in relation to these people. But in terms of the change, was there like a moment, or were there like certain moments, or was this,
yeah.
I would even say that it's, almost still ongoing in various ways.
Yeah, I think that I really appreciate that idea, Raz. I think one of the points, since you asked at the beginning, what is anti-Zionism, and it has to be a practice. It can't just be an end point. Like, look, I'm anti-Zionist. So yes, there are many points that changed for me. I had something so recognizable, and my change started. I'm thinking of Saul Brager's episode, Josh Schwabel's, my friend Roy Danovich, and we'll talk about Eli later, but Eli Meyerhoff. It's this very shared idea of radicalization in high school. So I think I was 15 or 16, and I met this person, Jane. And before this, I think I was mostly just kind of a sporty kid who had some psychological issues. And like I was vaguely liberal. So I think in like 10th grade, I started to get into film, and I started reading a lot, like thought I would be this artist, and I started to break from things. So there was like the seeds of radicalization there. But when my friend Jane came into the picture, she gave me this Noam Chomsky book. I still have that on my bookshelf for like the core role it played in my radicalization. It's one of his smaller books, The Prosperous Few and the Restless Many. I became a vegetarian. I started taking trips to the Wooden Shoe, which is a bookstore that's still around, a feminist anarchist bookstore in Philadelphia. I became obsessed with Rage Against the Machine. But yeah, I think critique of Israel, it was completely beyond my register. I think I didn't go too far into Chomsky's work in high school. And then in between high school and college, I took a gap year, and I was like working on organic farms and traveling. And this was during the siege of the West Bank, and they were shelling Arafat's compound. And I remember so vividly that I was having a conversation with all these folks I had just met in Spain, and they're all like, how can Israel get away with this? They're war criminals. And I don't know. I wish I could like interview my 18-year-old self. I wish I could be like, just don't be such a fucking liberal Zionist. But I'm not even sure if that's useful or relevant. But I don't remember what I was thinking, but I just remember being frozen. And then as soon as it was okay, I just ran out of there, because it was incomprehensible to me that these folks from Europe could believe this. So I ran, and I called my bubby, because I had a calling card, so I called my bubby on a telephone.
And that can explain to the young
people. I wanted some kind of affirmation and comfort, right? I remember running back to that, like we've talked about a little bit, about that sense of belonging. And I remember asking her, well, what should Israel do here? And whatever she said and whatever they did, it was the right answer. It was just how it was.
Thank you.
She said they shouldn't kill him because they'll make him a martyr. And it's funny, because I now have re-encountered so many moments from my childhood from a completely different perspective. And a few weeks ago, I finished this beautiful, beautiful book, Against the Loveless World by Susan Abu Hawa. And there's this scene that's just like very romantic and beautiful scene where the Zionist entity has everyone in the West Bank on lockdown during that 2002 siege. And to hear the story from the Palestinian perspective, it's both so powerful and so challenging. It re-educates in this very different way from when I was becoming an anti-Zionist and I Googled 2002 siege on West Bank and read about those events. But to the idea of like how things are changing, I didn't have anti-Zionism. I think also because a lot of my politics were very surface level. I was a theater major in college. I became obsessed with Bertolt Brecht and Harold Pinter. For folks who aren't into theater, those are two amazing political playwrights. And a little side note, my beautiful ginger cat, who is the biggest asshole in my love of 17 years, his name was Harold Pinter. And I think, especially because Harold Pinter, the human, was like, I don't know if he was anti-Zionist, but he was very anti-Israel. I did start to question things.
Just for listeners, which years are you?
This is like around 2002, 2003. I very much came up in the Iraq War, and I protested it. I was fiercely involved in anti-war stuff. I supported Dennis Kucinich for president. He was like imagine if Bernie had no energy. But I did all of this without really challenging my Zionism, my whiteness, my US-ness, right? All of that remained undisturbed. Like I remember I went to a ton of Iraq war protests, and we went down. I went to school where you went to school, Raz. My undergraduate is from Clark University. I remember going down to this protest in New York, and people were shouting, "Free Palestine, free Palestine." And at the time I was like, okay, yeah, I can get on board with this, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for protesting the Iraq war. And
Right. Here's a question. So you also just mentioned a very important thing you said my US-ness. Did you say my US-ness? No,
US citizenship. Yeah.
So did you ever think about, the relationship between the United States and Israel? How did you understand your US-ness? And did you ever think about, because you just mentioned I reached that protest, and I was there, okay, free Palestine, but we're not here for that, as if like there's no connection whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, how do you not see these things are connected? But yeah,
I'm just wondering if your implicit Jewishness, your ideas, or whatever it was about Israel, how does this US-ness, if at all, enter because you are, for lack of a better word, American, right?
Yeah. I think it was very ignorant and very unrefined. We, our best friends here have this kid who, when he was like 4 or 5, starting to like be exposed to the world, one of the first like little kid things he got obsessed with was Star Wars. And the way he made sense of it as like a 4-year-old is, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? And we sat down and watched it with him, and like 2 seconds in, it's like good guy or bad guy? Good guy or bad guy, right? He had to make sense of the world through bucketing the good guys versus the bad guys. I was doing that throughout high school. I think early into college, my understanding was that Judaism in my mind was so small and so flat that basically there were 3 kinds of Jews in the US and 1 kind of Jew in Israel. Of course, there were like a few British Jews. I heard that there were some Argentinian Jews, some Canadian Jews, but really there was this deep connection between the US and Israel, not because they're settler colonial states that have strategic interests in propping up their shitty systems, but rather because US Jews are really the only Jews left. I think I just thought that like the good guys, the Democrats, help make sure that Israel can stay safe.
You didn't actually know anything about the Jewish world.
No, I sure as fuck didn't know that there are non-white Jews, that in fact Judaism and whiteness have a very specific link.
And when you were thinking about your US-ness in relation to all of this, good guys, bad guys, this kind of divide, I mean, I'm reminded by this essay, I remember its title now, by Kurt Vonnegut, one of his kind of more like political essay, it's all Kurt Vonnegut style, where he says people imagine that there are 2 parties in this country, Democrats and Republicans, whereas there are 2 parties, but it's the winners and losers. So, all right, so take us back. You're in the protest.
Yeah, and like I said,
is that the first time you heard the phrase "Free Palestine"?
It probably was. I think I thought of myself more as this brooding radical artist who could just kind of be, like we're seeing now, celebrities who have always been against this and just so happen to be speaking up for the first time now. I do want to share that, like, where this led, which I'm very, very ashamed to say that I was like political without being political. So this eventually led to, I thought like I was starting to think like, yes, free Palestine. And yet this brings me so much shame, but I think it's important to note that I did birthright. So I was in college and I thought I can be a leftist, I can be against the Iraq war, and I can have like, without interrogating it, this idea of being for a free Palestine. And yet, at the same time, I can go on birthright. And I don't want to say too much about the trip. It's exactly like everyone says it is. It's weird because I was already with my partner, like Laren and I went together, and yet, as Saul Brager said in their episode, I think they were quoting somebody, but like it's basically a sex cult. They were the guides, our IOF protectors. I don't know. I'm making a face that you can't see on a podcast, but like they were encouraging us to drink and to have sex. Um and we recently recorded an episode with members of the organization Jaws, and Sam, one of the guests during that episode, brought this up. He talked about how there's this way that Zionism creates this very affective sexual relationship with the state of Israel itself. Like Israel is sexy, right? And I'm not talking about like the Max Darnell, like the muscle Jew idea. I'm talking about like this ideology itself, and this place itself is sexy. But yeah, I'll just close by saying like I didn't have the Israelism thing of I went, I saw the apartheid, and now look at all the work I'm doing. Like you said, it's a much longer process. It's an ongoing process. I mean, I do remember going to like, I wanted to go to East Jerusalem, and our guide was kind of blocking me. And I was like, why can't I see beyond here? And he's just like, it's not safe. And I kind of like questioned it and then moved on. But yeah, I still had clearly enough Zionism that I went to birthright.
Did you ever visit Israel again afterwards?
No, I think fortunately I started reckoning with my awful decisions. Right after college, when Larry and I were getting married, we moved to Chicago and we started attending synagogue every week, a deeply Zionist synagogue, by the way, called Temple Shalom. We'd done like high holidays in the past, and I think there were some gross moments. Like I would go to temple as an adult. There was this synagogue in Worcester that we went to when we were in college during the build up to the Iraq war, when the rabbi was like, I'm anti-war, and just like speaking about this. I was like, hell yeah, like this guy's awesome. And he said, I'm against the war because we shouldn't be using Arab oil. And I remember like finding that disgusting, but it didn't do anything to me, right? And so that year in Chicago, I was like very, very Jewish, and it was the first time in my life that every Friday was Shabbat. This is, I think, I'm fortunate that
Searching for a Jewish identity.
yes, exactly. I was very much in pursuit of Jewish identity, and to your question, I was very fortunate that I didn't end up back in Israel. I do just want to point out that this is like an inexcusable amount of Zionism. I think for me, again, as a U.S. born white millennial, maybe there's a certain amount of Zionism that's very prevalent. But again, the writer and organizer Anna Raja Gopal, who talked in their episode about really a need to reckon with this within Jewish spaces like this one. But I didn't really start to reckon with Zionism and what it means to go to a place like Israel, what it means to have a connection to a place like Israel, until I became a teacher.
I'm interested in this shift also because I want to really center what you said about back to this question about what is anti-Zionism, right? So anti-Zionism as a practice, what does that mean? How did you start practicing anti-Zionism?
That's a great way of framing it, that I think partially the answer to your question is anti-Zionism has become very much this kind of floating signifier that you can be like, oh, anti-Zionism is the fact that I want to elect somebody other than Netanyahu, right? I even see anti-Zionism as anything that thinks we can recover the state of Israel, anything that thinks that we can make the Levant just with settlers. I think, well, I'll answer your original question, and we can kind of
we can
come back to that. So I think to say how I started practicing anti-Zionism, I have to think back to how I took the next step in my political radicalization. It was really education that did it to me. Not like the concept of education, was being a teacher that did it to me. And I stumbled into a life of education. I wanted to be a playwright. My partner, Laren, was a biologist. And after Chicago, we applied to MFA and PhD programs. She got into all over the place. And I had like one maybe option in Los Angeles. And we decided, okay, the compromise, the kind of way we're going to do this is she'll go to Rutgers in New Jersey and I'll find some kind of work in the city and just write plays. And I was very fortunate to find my way into a teaching position with no training, no certificate, no background. Unfortunately, that was because it was at a charter school. And I want to qualify that by saying, like, I met some amazing people there. And I really owe my entire education to my dear friend Emily. Again, one of the first people I met when I got to undergraduate, this amazing person named Emily, just so happens to be Jewish, right? It's this implicit thing, but I'm endlessly thankful for what she made possible for me. But I hated every second of this job. I was an awful teacher. It took me about a decade to realize that actually I think I love teaching more than anything else in this world. And I hated the way that we as teachers were treated, not as workers, not as intellectuals. We were colonial managers of Black and brown kids. I hated that it was a school that led with discipline and compliance rather than like inquiry and care. And of course, all of this is to say nothing of the fact that it was just a neoliberal force actively attacking public education. But that's for another podcast. So I'm in this job that I hate about 6 months. I'm not really very well read in politics or theory, right? I'd spent all of my time in high school and college reading plays. I think like I'd read like the Communist Manifesto. I think I read some Nietzsche.
In high school is kind of obligatory.
Yeah, exactly. I'm deep. I'm brooding. Here's my copy of Beyond Good and Evil. But I didn't have anything beyond that. And so I'm flailing about thinking like, how the fuck am I going to survive a career if this is what it is? Like, how do I navigate this shitty institution? I think Roy Danovich and talked about how he's really navigated kind of in this disruptive way, the institution of schooling while trying to build school as a collective community. And it's just really fucking hard. So I don't know, anytime I had a prep period, I'm just Googling and trying to think like, what can I do here? I came across, I found this thing at UCLA called what I thought was like the Free Air Institute. And I'm like, what the hell is this? This sounds amazing. I don't know who this person is. It's so cool. And I mentioned this to my friend Paul, and he's like, you don't know who Paulo Freire is? And I was like, no, I've never heard that name before in my life. And so the next day I go to the Brooklyn Library, I get a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's like those scenes in a movie where just a whole new world, not Aladdin, not that Orientalist shit, but just a whole new world opens up before somebody.
Something that you just said now, you went to the library.
Yeah. Yeah. So I went to the library, I'm reading it, and it's just blowing my mind. Maybe the better way of describing it is it's like when you get bitten by the radioactive spider and your DNA is being completely rewired with each of Freire's sentences. Not that Pedagogy of the Oppressed turns you into Spider-Man, turns you into a more nuanced political figure. But just like from this fiercer, more radical politics was coming about, right? It led to me reading Fanon, actually reading Marx in a substantial way. I can be a pretty dramatic person, as I mentioned, but I really put myself into things. And this was one of those things. I mean, I put myself into it so much, I literally have a Paulo Freire tattoo. And like, I don't remember Palestine factoring in here, but it was definitely present. And there was anti-Zionism emerging. I know at this time I started calling myself, I think by about 2010-ish, I was calling myself an anti-Zionism, and I was breaking up with Judaism. It was a bit out of like being rigid, but like you mentioned, I had a very small sense of Judaism. I didn't know the Bund was a thing. I knew that like Jews were liberals in the Chuck Schumer sense, right? I learned about like radical Jews in history, but I assumed that they were doing the same thing I was, which is
not a Jew anymore.
Oh, right. Of course. Thank you. I wish I could have had like the writings of George Habash or something, but for myself as a Jew, yeah, I needed something to show Judaism as something else. I think we had this guest, Joe Feinberg, who co-wrote this beautiful, I think it was called The Declaration of the Diaspora. And there's so much there that can suggest that we don't need to be thinking about Jewish futures right now. We need to be reckoning with Jewish complicity, but that Zionism can not only be free, not only that Jews can be free from Zionism, but that Jews can be free from any nation state. And I'm thinking here about actually an episode that we just released with the abolitionist writer Rachel Joy, who talks about like actually these radical forms of collective care that I'm reading about at this time, that's actually central to Judaism. I'm also very thankful for that time I had with breaking up with Judaism, because I think it allowed me to focus my energy on becoming politically conscious and asking the really important questions that I needed to ask of myself and of my politics without returning to that central question I know we always ask: am I being a good Jew in this moment? Right? I didn't want that as a reference point. It did mean that I felt like really kind of out of shape with Judaism when I came back, but I think it has allowed in the last few years, as I've come back to Judaism, kind of a healthier relationship to it as a cultural identity.
So in this kind of transition to anti-Zionism and thinking about anti-Zionism as a practice, you just mentioned now this thing about Jewish values, right? Which I argue is a very slippery slope back into the trap, actually, in some of it. Maybe tell us a bit more about how you started thinking through these readings, right, about education and liberation. You know, what are these exactly Jewish values?
I think I'm the wrong person to talk about with that. And like I said, I think it's helpful for many people to find Jewish values to guide them. Um, I think I'm personally I'm guided by politics, particularly politics of liberation. And I do agree with you that I think, because Zionism is a Jewish value, right? You can make the case. It becomes very, like, to use the term you used, slippery. It's anything.
I'm also thinking about frames of thought, anti-Zionist frames of thought, right, that are rooted, in thinking about Jewish values that emerge from thinking about the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
But then, of course, we're fully within the trap of thinking about this kind of Holocaust as a guiding issue for us, because it is actually so significant in human history. It is that, or to use the Zionist term, unique. But if the Holocaust is unique, that brings us back to this trap of Jews are unique and whoops, Israel is unique.
Yep.
As within, so that's what I mean. Just interrogating. And again, I don't have any answers myself, right? You said I was starting. Yeah, I was breaking up with Judaism. You said I was making my way back into Judaism. You use this kind of Jewish values. We don't have to resolve any of this. We just think it's important that may have broader significance for people's journeys.
I think you're right. I don't have any point of resolution here. I think it's a messy thing.
Yeah. And so we're around 2010, right?
Yeah, I think like 2010.
You have 15 years ago.
This is kind of where it takes a bit of a tough turn. I'd love to say that this is the time when I read Freire and I became a revolutionary, right? This led me down an uninterrupted path of solidarity, thinking towards Palestinian liberation, and then joining the Palestine Solidarity Movement. But, life is often interrupted. We talked a lot about how to frame this, so I'm going to keep it kind of vague. But, around this time, Laren was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And very quickly, my focus shifted from maybe organizing a union in my charter school and getting involved in radical politics throughout New York City. And it became just a job of surviving and caretaking. I mean, I don't want to make this is not the story of our difficult lives, but I think that there's value in sharing kind of how this is relevant to the work of Jewish anti-Zionists. And I should also say that I've had my own mental health struggles that have always been very present, sometimes overwhelming, but I bring this up to maybe offer, like, I'll share this one story. So you point out 2010, this is also 2011. So this is Occupy. And I wanted so deeply to be involved in Occupy. And so I'd get off of work in Crown Heights after a 12-hour shift, because elementary school kids to go from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. and we were expected to show up early and late. It's just this kind of savior complex, whatever. So after work, I'd go to Occupy, but I just stand there on the outside and I'd like stare off into space with these kind of like hollow eyes, mentally completely not present. And I just look at this amazing political possibility in Zuccotti Park. I would just stand there, and then maybe after about half an hour, I'd walk on, head back to the subway. I point this out because I think I've said so many times in organizing spaces, even on this podcast, that I think we should always do more and we should always push ourselves. And clearly, all of the work that we've done in the last 2 years has been insignificant. It has clearly not been enough. But I think that we also need to do more about caring for each other within movement spaces and speaking to ourselves, like speaking inward. I think that we need to sometimes be gentle and forgiving. I think that so many times in social movement spaces, we talk about disability rights and self-care, but ultimately there's so many times that I'm like, we're just really shitty at this. I don't know, maybe I just bring this up to say, like, we obviously have to build coalitions and we obviously have to build places to check in and make the work of liberation long and inviting and also rigorous, right? Not such a big tent as like inviting in the sense of holding people who are struggling. We have to build together.
I think that's a really important point, which we understand that going back to anti-Zionism as a practice, then it's not, and if we really think about this in terms of liberation, specifically Palestinian liberation, but we can also think about Jewish liberation in that order, in the sense that Jewish liberation at this point, and this is perhaps part of the trap, right, is inextricably intertwined with Palestinian liberation. But this is one of the moments now in 2025, I think, where it's so difficult to imagine when this will happen and how this will happen. I mean, 22 months of this horrific genocide on our screens constantly, dehumanization, and I mean, it's just debilitating. And there are days when I'm sure that so many people who are engaged and who are involved, who are just exhausted and, just let me stare at the ceiling here. And then add to that all the personal issues. But if we understand, so this is why I think your comment here is so very important and actually essential, because I think people have to understand that anti-Zionism as a practice is not about one thing. It's not about heroic, or just going to a protest here or there. It's really about this kind of routine. And as with every routine, it'll be interrupted also by mental health issues and exhaustion. And I don't know, if anything comes up that is like an emergency issue, like say with my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter, then that comes before anything, obviously. Yeah. But if we're in the frame of a routine, what I like to start calling these days, like routines of resistance, that everything we do and how we think and how we interact, we infuse who we are and what we do with this routines of resistance, then it also is about failure and exhaustion. And because it's not a linear thing, it's not, and it has and requires so much imagination, because as I said, at this point, how will we see Palestinian liberation and therefore Jewish liberation? I think your point here is really, really essential, Jordan.
I appreciate that. I think what you're saying too, Raz, is that, again, I've said several times, I'm a very dramatic thinker. And I think often, and it still pops in my head, like, I'm just going to go join the PFLP. That's what we need, right? Is that we need Jews to do nothing other than join the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. But that kind of like individualized heroism is not what's needed. And to see it as routine.
Also, I think that once people understand that this is something that can be and should be routine, that's where people actually find, right, the different frameworks in their communities, in their places where they feel comfortable. And they also find the places where they don't feel comfortable, actually. And that's also perfectly fine. I think that I think your comment here is so central, because we should never forget that we are fragile and vulnerable and struggle for liberation. As you said, if we don't also really highlight this and take care of each other and take care of ourselves. So I think your comment here, it's not about making it about your tragic story. It's really about adding an element that is crucial for the struggle of liberation.
Yeah.
So what happens like in this last decade, say?
Yeah. Yes. So I hadn't really talked about actual anti-Zionism, right? I was more talking about politics and becoming like more of a leftist and having anti-Zionism in the background. So where I think there were two stages where anti-Zionism really took a more central role. The first is this eventually led to grad school. I started out doing like peace studies and educational anthropology, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna like be this disruptive force in institutional spaces. I'm gonna be like the sand in the gears of the World Bank or something like that. Again, like dramatic and unrealistic so many times over. And then the person with whom I wanted to study decided to move universities. And they were like, hey, well, you should meet this new young professor named Danny Friedrich. And meeting this guy was kind of like my Paulo Freire moment. I don't know, maybe it was like this more like maybe it was like the star-crossed lovers and meeting in the Notebook moment. Anyway, I applied to a doctorate with this guy, and Danny has become my greatest intellectual mentor, my closest collaborator, a best friend. He was the guest along with Roy Danovich on the Educator Friends episode. And among a million other things, we bonded over being anti-Zionist Jews. But I think what I learned from him was more how to think in playful ways that see education as ongoing, which has contributed to this idea of I don't become an anti-Zionist and then it's over, right? It's that education is so much more complex and its role in the world is so much more complex. I think it also informed how I respond to other people. I think that stuck out. In his episode, he talked about his mom and how her thinking has continued to evolve when it comes to Palestine. But I think, grad school was also kind of pathetic in that way because I didn't really connect with the folks in my cohort. So I was kind of like the kid in elementary school whose best friend is the teacher. It took a long time. But
this is Teachers College Columbia, right?
Yeah, this is a Teachers College Columbia University. And eventually I finally kind of formed this group of friends. I had to go outside my department and we formed this study group. I think we called ourselves like the Anarchist Pedagogy Study Group, something like that. And this is where I think Palestine started to play this, and in class worked in tandem to kind of for Palestine to take on a more central role for me. And like this is where this really fierce radical politics comes about for me. So I really loved this time, but at the same time that again the life happens thing reared its head. I'm not sure if it was burnout beyond Laren and my health. I like this time, as a grad student, I was working just to like make rent every month. I had a modest stipend, but I think even for a grad student, I had a lot of jobs. So I don't know. I think maybe it was like my depression, my OCD acting up. For whatever reason, I just like after all of this organizing, getting kind of some energy again, I again like found myself just unable to move. I had to kind of like mask participating in my research assistant job. I was a student teacher supervisor, and I'd like find ways to skip it. And like, this kind of, again, I'm not saying this, as I mentioned, to like, I'm not trying to garner sympathy or kind of excuse my level of political engagement. I just think that this also, I mentioned this also because this podcast has been so much about what people are doing. And when I was thinking about how this episode would look, I was like, I want to mention a time when I show what people aren't doing. Not like silence and apathy, but just to reiterate that we should be holding ourselves accountable and simultaneously realizing, I think this is what you and I were hinting at. We can't make justice by pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps. When I think of the genocide, like so many people, I ask, what right do I have to take a rest? What right do I have to do something other than work tirelessly? But there's a flip side to that, right? What good am I doing if I'm playing into the neoliberal logics of I can be the hero and I will save things? That's a colonial mindset that will absolutely not be useful.
And also, if it's a long struggle as it is and will continue to be, then we also need to be strategic about saving our energy at times. And we do sometimes need to sleep and to rest or just to be on the couch and stare at the ceiling.
Yeah. But I think you would ask kind of like, really, I mentioned all this, but the central question is how my anti-Zionism and understanding of Palestine and Palestinians is coming into frame here. And I think, of course, it was a bit stagnated at this point in grad school. And there had been these like little sputters of anti-Zionist action. I'd signed letters. I started speaking out more in class. especially at Columbia, right? Columbia is like the most fiercely Zionist place you will ever encounter, right? This is worse than my suburban Philadelphia synagogue. The idea that Jews are unsafe on that campus ever, I just like, are you fucking serious? Shai Davidai, fuck off. I mean, um, so okay, so I made some Palestinian and Jordanian friends. Like we'd be kind of aligned in class discussions, and I'm thinking of there's this one critical geography class I took that brings up a lot of memories. This woman spoke about being detained by the IOF and how she had to change her entire thesis project because she wouldn't be able to get across these Zionist borders. And it wasn't exactly eye-opening, but it really entrenched my commitments. I think to see these kind of quiet dismissals, eye rolls whenever she raised her hand in class, that itself was enraging, but I kept thinking about her research. Like, I could have done that thesis, right? I, at the time, didn't identify with Judaism. I was focused on something completely different. I was actually really angry with Judaism. But by virtue of being a white Jew, this thing that woman was so passionate about, that was so personal to her, that she had devoted so much to, was denied to her and would be freely offered to me. And I want to give a mention to one thing in particular, and also she's been in the news. I think one of the things that really kind of kicked my ass into gear was reading Thea Abu El-Hajj's Unsettled Belonging. It's a book about Palestinian Americans in the U.S., and they also visit Palestine and how they're treated there. And not only is I think this one of the best ethnographies of education, this is really where I started shaping my anti-Zionist politics. So by 2016, I was very firmly identifying as an anti-Zionist. I was supporting BDS. I was speaking out in class. But I think beyond that, maybe like signing letters and kind of like the echo chamber of grad school, I really thought of this mostly as like a personal decision. I thought I'm going to focus on migrant justice because that's actually where most of my activism and scholarship was taking shape. And my anti-Zionism and being part of the Palestine solidarity movement is going to be more like a personal choice.
So it seems like you're still thinking at that point, like a decade ago, that it could theoretically be detached, that we can talk about migrant justice without necessarily seeing how it's closely intertwined with Palestinian liberation.
Yeah, or maybe more that, of course, they're intertwined, but I have to pick and choose my battles. Now, of course, this changed. You know, I think the move to anti-Zionism and joining the Palestine solidarity movement, there were two things that really got me going. So, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, Raz, the first one, it was you. Yeah. So when I got my job at Stockton, we had recently moved to Philadelphia. I was hired to the School of Education, and they just had no idea what to do with me. My department, with a few amazing exceptions, is really focused on upholding the oppressive machinery of schooling. I think niceness is always privileged above educational justice. Bureaucratic compliance is favored very much over intellectual and cultural work. The cultural work of being a teacher is something people, to speak about like Blackness, to mention Palestine. I mean, these things just don't show up in our curriculum outside. I don't want to be like, I'm awesome, but like, unless you're taking a class with me or one other professor who I don't know if they want to be named, you're learning about how to write a lesson plan. And so very quickly, I think they're like, okay, you need to do something else with this job. So they had me join the migration studies minor. So I met with the coordinator of that program. And about 90 seconds into our Zoom, Jess is like, oh, do you know Raz? And I'm like, no, who's she? Who is this lady? So you and I met. It was during the height of the pandemic. We're on Zoom. You shared some of your writing, that 972 piece that I can't believe that's from, was that 2019? That's from 2019. It's about the IHRA, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Just last week, you and I went to New Jersey. You spoke beautifully. They are still set to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, but I don't know. It's to focus on kind of the narrative here. I think it's worth noting that this was during the attacks on Sheikh Jarrah in 2021. So you said I should join the Holocaust and Genocide Studies department. It was like, if I'm going to be part of a program like this, then my work has to relate to it. And I should, it's long overdue, but I actually have to show that anti-Zionism can't just be a personal choice. It has to be, so here's where we're kind of getting to a definition, an active, ongoing educational praxis, right? It has to be something that's part of our routines. And I think you also showed me that it has to be part of our job.
It's mutual because you came at a time exactly when we were the people involved in the program. We were thinking that is the people more closely involved in the program. Really, we were thinking, how do we really steer the program this is the way I'm going to say it now. How are we going to steer the program away from the track of Holocaust and genocide studies that is really a Zionist construction, right, of the hierarchy of Holocaust and genocide studies, where the Holocaust is unique by definition in this Holocaust and genocide framework, right? And that's exactly when we kind of met, as you said. So it was really mutual, this kind of impact, we kind of developed together with others and are still trying to do it in this, impossible conditions of New Jersey public higher education. I feel bad, but this also brings us back to this kind of practice and what we were trying to do in the program, which is, or what, as I understand it, which brings us back to this kind of Zionist trap, because, the Holocaust is an integral part or Holocaust education, right, is an integral part of the Zionist trap in that sense.
I think you also showed me that it's important to push in every space. I would never have thought that a statement from Stockton University's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Department would be helpful or useful. And then seeing like the statements that we put out, I think that kind of pushed me. Again, it's the smaller ways, the quieter ways that we're doing it. I don't have any hope in institutions, but we need to still, if I'm going to go there, I'm going to talk about Palestine. And if I go there, I'm going to try to build. I think that's one cool thing. I've built some great friends and some great collaborations through the idea of let's talk, if we're going to go to a conference, about Palestine here because it needs to play a more central role. But I did want to bring in a second thing about kind of where this really took shape. So I think the first is you. It's when I started teaching about Palestine in my classroom. It's when I started putting it wasn't yet into my work. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the second is kind of like the non-formal education space, which is where I always come back to. And I think that's really been in becoming an organizer. And I think that's happened really in parallel with my partner, Laren. I'm thinking of the couple, Dan Cohen and Julie Kosofsky had an episode. They're Chicago organizers and educators. And they just share that there's so much joy, maybe not joy, but that they care for and hold each other in this organizing work. I pointed out before that Laren and I had all these false starts. We'd try to be committed organizers, and then life interrupts and health interrupts and money interrupts, just life shit interrupts. I kind of had in my head that we would move to Philly and like be badass organizers. Like we decided kind of halfway through grad school that we grew up outside of Philly. Our closest friends are here. I'm incredibly close to my parents. We wanted to become foster parents. We wanted to be here. So everything was kind of set up for us to move back to Philly and become badass organizers. And we moved back in 2019 while I was writing my dissertation. And then obviously the pandemic, there was some awful health stuff that happened in 2020 and 2021. And we'd go to marches during the 2020 uprisings and things like that, but it was just so marginal. And then in early 2023, Laren just threw herself into things. She started organizing with Extinction Rebellion, and she like really committed to XR and a couple of other climate justice groups as an organizer and as a photographer. And this really inspired me. And so I think amidst these just like unbearable times, amidst the impossibility of this genocide, even though like I get very anxious at protests or if I'm participating in a direct action, that's really where I felt not like joy, but maybe that I've practiced hope, especially when I see Laren working. There's this one march that we did. It was like February of 2024. It was like wet and cold and yet such a Philly day. It was also somehow humid. And people in Philly always bring a ton of energy to protests. And we're marching through the city and then like ran onto the Ben Franklin Bridge to block it. And Laren like got this really cool photograph of this lone figure on the bridge, like waving a 10-foot Palestinian flag. And I think sometimes protests, at least beyond my own anxieties, can be like largely symbolic when what we need to actually do is, speaking from an educational perspective, what we need to do is study the tactics that stop the flow of arms. We need to find ways to interrupt settlers. We need to stop the machinery of Zionism. But there's something so powerful in that moment. And then maybe I'll close by talking about like the last 2 years. Maura Finkelstein joked on her episode that like her entire personality has become Palestine. I'm nothing like Maura. She is doing the most amazing, powerful work. But similarly, like this is everything for me. I'm not an expert on Palestine. I'm an anthropologist of education who uses a lot of theory to study immigration and teacher education. But for good and necessary reasons, Palestine solidarity has become everything in my life. I'm not a fan of op-eds or academic writing. I think I like the idea of taking like ideas and teasing them out. I'm not sure where that leaves me for publishing, but like a few examples. So there's this Nietzschean Foucauldian idea of like we live our lives like a work of art. So I applied that idea of what does it mean to live pedagogically, to live our lives educationally, and I thought with that using Aaron Bushnell as an example of specifically an example of extreme solidarity, right? How do we live pedagogically in ways that move in solidarity with Palestinian liberation? I have some more formal writing coming out, one in the Journal of Critical Education, edited by the wonderful Hanadi Shatara, that actually uses some of your ideas, Raz, about disavowal. I take up a curriculum of disavowal. I'm actually, as soon as we end this interview, I'm working on a piece for a conference. Again, I don't have any faith in academia. I think that sometimes a 1,000 to 2,000 word proposal is a great way of teasing out and kind of rehearsing ideas. And then the question is like, then what do you do with a 3,000 word essay on Aaron Bushnell as educator? I don't know where to submit any of this, but the current piece is actually reconsidering the relationship between political education and direct action within the Palestine solidarity movement, specifically in the global north. I want to ask, like, is it even possible to do education? Do we need education, or can we just, do we need study, or can we just struggle? And I might be focusing on a particular group that may have been recently proscribed. And I want to say too, like the real work for me is the everyday work, the organization Jewish White Supremacy. That's really that, and my classroom practice, I think, are where I hope to have impact. I don't know that my writing will do anything, but I teach Palestine. I refuse to teach because of Palestine. I don't just see that as like this like activist-y way of being like, I'm not teaching, I'm withholding it. Like, no. Okay, here's an example. I teach this class called Practice and Techniques of Teaching. It's a student teacher class. They're about a year away from becoming teachers. They're already doing field work in New Jersey public schools. And there have been a number of days in the last 22 months where I had spent the hour before class doing what so many of us do all day. You know, maybe I did something like sign a letter. Maybe I donated to some org, but then I watched the live stream genocide. I saw videos of children blown to pieces by Israel with US made and US funded bombs. And I'd watch strips of children with their parents carrying them in flour sacks. And then I go teach how to write a lesson plan for third grade math. Like what? So all that to say, I think that vulnerability and honesty, I think, is a good teaching practice. So I'd go into class, I'd say, I'm having a really hard time teaching, and the genocide is why. And guess what? You as teachers are going to be asked to do the very same thing. You're going to be with children during these really challenging times. What will you do that day? What will you do the day after? How will you be both honest and protect your children? How will you care for them? And then we talk about this shit, right? We make space to leave these things unresolved. They ask really hard questions like, what if you have Zionist parents who are complaining that you should be an apolitical teacher? That doesn't exist, but they're still saying it, right? And of course, we look at examples. I model how to design lessons and units where student voices are centered and teaching is always politically and always culturally responsive. I bring in resources. I ask my early childhood educators, do you think this video of Miss Rachel would be useful in how you might talk about something like this with younger children? What would you change, right? It's all about just like embodying a pedagogy of collective care and, again, centering Palestine. And there's this certain way of showing up for your students as well, often in very subtle ways. I think you've seen after October 7th, I put watermelons all over my laptop. So when I start class, when I'm showing something, right, I want my students to see that. And then after too many of them were like, hey, that's for Palestine, right? Nice. I was like, oh, this is too subtle. So now it's 2 stickers saying end the genocide and teach Palestine. On the converse of that, I think that classrooms are really spaces apart. We spoke in the encampment episode about how encampments challenge not just the university, but formalized classrooms themselves. And they should absolutely connect to everyday realities. But I do think that there's radical possibility in public schools and in university classrooms. Classrooms are spaces, where you can mess around, you can take risks, you can say the wrong thing, and the consequences are different than they would be outside of the classroom. And this is awful. I forget who said this on the podcast. One of the guests talked about wanting their students to express their Zionism in the classroom, like when you're in high school and parents are like, kids, drink here so you don't do it out there, right? Like, don't drink and drive. Like, do your Zionism, get it out here so we can deal with it in the classroom space. I'm not saying I'll lecture or chastise somebody for being a Zionist. I don't think that you can just explicate and lecture your way out of Zionism. But I will challenge my students and be clear on my standpoint. But also, I say this to say that a classroom is for people who show up. And if a fascist shows up, which happens a lot in university classrooms, you do have to protect your other students first and foremost. But where on the street, I might advocate for punching fascists and Zionists. But for punching fascists in the classroom, that suddenly turns into a pedagogical concern. Right? It's a pedagogical issue rather than a face punching issue. To the protecting students part, I open all my classes with this idea of I hate that everybody's just to piggyback off of this, just to build on what you were saying. I want people to be, I'm a non-confrontational person, but I want people to confront each other. I think there's so much trust in saying, you are wrong. This is wrong, and here's why, and really getting into it. But I always say, if you deny somebody's right to equally exist in this classroom space, I go from completely horizontal anti-authoritarian classrooms to me being the arbiter of that. And I just shut it down, right? If there's any anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, transphobia, misogyny, anything, I say, I shut it down. But again, it's a pedagogical issue. I'm not going to lower your grade. I'm not going to call. I'm not a cop. I'm not going to report anyone, at least beyond my obligation as a mandated reporter. But if you want to tell me why trans people are dangerous, let's discuss in my office. But this is not part of the classroom space. And so that's the formal one. And then I think I'll close with saying, I think Jews Against White Supremacy has really been, and I won't say too much of it because I think that we did an entire episode, but I feel like non-formal political education carries so much potential. So outside of the classroom, this is also another plug for, I encourage more principled anti-Zionism, so joining JAWS. But I think that there's a lot of potential in engaging in the radical work and the coalition building that takes place centered around unmaking whiteness, unmaking capitalism, unmaking colonialism, all with the focus of Palestine solidarity. Thanks so much for listening today and throughout the season. This is no time to celebrate or congratulate, but my deepest gratitude to all of our guests this season, both for contributing to this project and more broadly for their work within the Palestine solidarity movement. In that vein, an enormous amount of thanks to Sam and Yardane, my co-producers. From Yardane's scores to Sam's ideas around fundraising and social media, they've done so much behind-the-scenes work. And one final announcement. We'll be sharing this on our social media, but we're going to do a big fundraiser where we'll match funds for the Smear Project. You can find out more about that on our Instagram, Another Ed is Possible. So, I guess that's it. I hope to see you in the streets, at the next study session. Let's help each other out at the next direct action and fight like hell wherever we are. And in October or November, we'll be back with a brand new season of Another Education is Possible.